video, we will see how to work with variables in our code. So let's create a new project, a console application. Name it variables. I'll open my main.cpp file, remove the cout statement, and now I'm ready to code. So first of all, let me specify what I wish to do using this program. So I wish to try using variables and understand some operators. First of all, what I want this program to do is add two numbers. So for adding two numbers, I need two numbers. I'll start with integers. So I need two integers. I will define them as int denoting integers. Then I'll name them num1 and num2. So num1 and num2 are the name I have chosen for my variables. You can give any valid identifier as your variable name. So this statement is the definition of my variables. So I'm telling the compiler that num1 and num2 are the two variables. So reserve some space in memory for these two variables. And these two variables are of integer type, so reserve the memory according to that. Now I wish to put some value into these spaces. For the time being, num1 and num2 contain any garbage value. To put a logical value into these variables, I'll write num1 equals to say 5 and num2 equals to 2. So this is initialization of my variables. I have initialized them. I have given an initial value to these variables. Then I need to add these variables. I do num1 plus num2, and then I need to store the result in another variable. So I need another integer. I call it sum and put it equal to num1 plus num2. So in this statement, I have combined my definition part and my initialization part. So this shows how you can combine the two in just one statement. You can write them separately, you can combine them together. It's your wish. Let's now just print your sum, and it should work correctly. It should show me 7, which is 5 plus 2. Let's see the output, which in fact is 7. Now let's try it with floating point numbers. So I make it float instead of int. The sum would also be a floating point number. And let's change the values. Maybe let's say 5.5 and 2.2. You can check the answer. It is the expected answer 7.7. Now let's change this plus by divide. Let's restore the values back to 5 and 2. So I wish to divide 5 by 2 and the answer should be 2.5. I run it and yes, the answer is 2.5. Let's say logically my num1 and num2 are integers, right? They are not floating point numbers. So I make them int. But the answer I want should be a floating point number, because when you are dividing 5 by 2, you get 2.5. It's a floating point number. So my result is a floating point number. Let's run it and see the output again. But no, the answer is 2 this time. Now why did that happen? So it looks like my num1 is an integer, my num2 is an integer, and dividing an integer by another integer yields the answer as an integer. So the right hand side of equal to is an integer, and you are storing an integer in the place of a floating point number. So making the data type of result a float is not making any difference because the value you are storing is ultimately an integer. So what is the solution? I will typecast my num1 as a floating point number. So this is called explicit typecasting. I enclose my data type within parentheses and write it in front of the variable which I wish to typecast. By explicitly typecasting my variable, I mean that I am telling the compiler explicitly that for the execution of this particular statement, I want my num1 to behave as a floating point number. Minded, it is not changing the data type of num1 itself. Num1 was an integer before this statement. Num1 would remain an integer after this statement. Just for the evaluation of this particular phrase, my num1 is considered to be a floating point number. Now, since the division is occurring between a floating point number and an integer, the answer would be a floating point number, that is 2.5. So here is the answer. There is another operator which is called the modulo operator, and it is denoted by the percentage sign. And percentage sign will give you the remainder. So you are dividing 5 by 2. The quotient part is 2, which you get when you write 5 divided by 2. And we also get a remainder, which is 1. That we will get when we use the modulo operator or the remainder operator. The remainder would be an integer, so I'll change the data type to an int. Let's see the answer, which is 1. One more thing, this modulo operator would work only with integers. And it makes sense too, right? When you divide a floating point number with another floating point number, or you divide a floating point number with an integer or any such thing, when either of your operands is not an integer, you are not concerned with remainder. When you are dividing floating point numbers, you need the exact answer. You need 2.5 and not 2 and 1 separately. So if I run it, I will most probably get an error. Yeah. Invalid operands of type float and float to binary operator modulo. The operator can get only integer as its operands. Okay, that would be all from my side. Try out this code yourself. Make yourself more comfortable with variables because they are important. Variables would be used in every program you make. So make yourself quite comfortable with them. Try out an exercise. Make 5 or 6 variables storing the scores, the marks of a student in various subjects. Make another variable to where you'll store the percentage, you'll calculate the percentage of that student based on that marks, and you'll store it in another variable. And then finally, you'll print the result of the student, whatever percentage he has attained. So try it out, think upon the data types each variable should have, then define your variables, initialize them, and code it.